Welcome to Civic Engines. How are you, Dave?
Pretty good. How are you doing, James?
Pretty good. Tired, but
Tired.
that's par for the course in winter.
So what are we talking about today?
Today we're talking about political terminologies, ideological identities that people in America use for describing themselves. I'd say we are very sloppy at how we describe ourselves. You're either Republican or Democrat, left, right. What are some of the other terms? Progressive, conservative. They all kind of
Socialist, communist.
Yeah, that gets a little bit more into who's more involved in putting thought into how they describe themselves. But there's a lot of conflation with these political terms.
Yeah.
And so today we want to give our own definitions of what these terms mean, to kind of help pull apart, well, what does someone mean when they say I'm conservative? And does that necessarily mean that they're also Republican and, an evangelical Christian and a neocon and anti-abortion and all of these things that get lumped together? Because there's a lot of controversies that we've been stuck on for decades. And I don't think we're going to ever move past them or respect the differences of people who think differently on these terms without being able to say, well, no, I'm a conservative, but that doesn't mean that I'm a Republican loyalist. I'm not always voting Republican, or it doesn't mean that I'm pro-war.
Right.
So I buy into conservative thought and liberal thought. And so if that confuses people, hopefully they'll get a better idea how those two concepts can, how someone could congruently hold on to both of those two ideologies and integrate them together and not be contradictory. Because,
well, it depends. What do you mean by liberal thought? Are we talking classical liberalism?
Classical
thought?
liberal.
Well, that matches up mostly with, because a lot of what classical liberalism is not. None of it is demonstrated in the Democratic Party today, and
absolutely
part of it is in the Republican Party, but the majority of it's in Libertarian Party, or
true.
What they say. I've got my own opinions on the Libertarian Party and whether they stick with that classical liberalism. Okay, go on. The contradiction between the.
But that's exactly right. There's these terms that are, on one hand, a philosophy, and on the other hand, how people take it when you say I'm a liberal, I'm a conservative. They take it as you saying I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican. And
right.
The political parties are probably some of the worst representations of those philosophies.
Definitely.
They took those ideas, they adopted them. They probably, at the outset, took up, okay, we're the conservative party or we're the liberal party. That's what we're defending. That's what we're marketing ourselves for. But over time, they've severely bastardized those terms, and the way that the general populace reads those is, oh, you're on blue team or you're on red team. Mm-hmm. And so we want to today talk about these terms, what they actually mean, not as a team sport team, but rather as a ideological anchor, as an ideological base of, like, this is a starting point. I agreed to these general principles, and I'm going to branch out depending on the controversy we're talking about, or the, what would you call it, like the moral dilemma. And then the other thing that I want to get into is these kind of smear words that people throw around at the people that they are afraid of or don't understand, don't care to understand, don't, love to dunk on online. So, it's like, if you're on the left, people are totalitarian, authoritarian, fascist, neo-Nazi, xenophobic,
nationalists.
They throw all of these terms together and conflate them all together. Nazi, and if you're on the right, you're talking about a blue-haired, liberal, progressive, I don't know, postmodern communist.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, well, all of those mean different things. And so maybe let's...
War pig, also fascists. I mean, some of those are shared. Like the left will call the right fascist, but the right also calls the left fascist.
And almost every time that someone throws those around, for one thing, it's so annoying when they pile them all together, because you're basically just... You're taking whatever will stick on them as a persona non grata. Like, I don't need to entertain your thoughts. You're a bad person. That's what they're trying to do. But it's like, okay, you're using these words, xenophobic, fascist, totalitarian, authoritarian, bigot. Yeah. It's like, could you actually define those words? Could you differentiate a totalitarian from an authoritarian?
Yeah.
So that's kind of what we want to talk about today.
Okay. Where should we start out then?
I think let's start out with the political compass. I saw this probably starting in 2016, and it kind of starts the conversation about, well, if you're on the left or you're on the right, those are the only two sides. That's kind of how Americans typically look at each other as far as political identities. But this political compass here it adds literally a dimension to that spectrum. So there's the x-axis, and now here's a y-axis that's saying, well, maybe you're on the left, maybe you're on the right, but how much do you impose your thoughts on the other side? That's the y-axis. And so this conceptualizes the upper axis, the positive y-axis, as authoritarian, which is I think this way and you need to think this way too, and otherwise I can't tolerate you. And you're actually causing harm to me and to society if you don't agree with me out of the box. And then the opposite, the kind of negative y-axis, has this libertarian side of the spectrum, which is more live and let live. I have my views, you have yours, let's agree to disagree. And by
left and right, they're talking purely economics in here, it looks like.
And starting with left and right, that's already a term that annoys me. We can get into the history of why left and right exist, but it's like...
Yeah, I'm wondering if this is sufficient.
As for all the terms that we're going to go over today, there's usually a root word. Like authoritarian, the root word is authority. And so then the idea is I am going to place more stock in authoritative sources. So it's like, well, this person... it's irresponsible for you to talk about this because you don't have a degree in the subject matter. Is something you'll hear people who I would regard as authoritarian say a lot. Or it's like, you're not a doctor, so it's irresponsible for you to be talking about medical conditions or nutrition advice because you don't have an MD. This is complicated stuff, and you could cause a lot of harm by giving people the wrong advice.
But as far as political structures, what is it? Monarchy or dictators? I mean, I'd imagine those are
more authoritarian. Yep.
Even oligarchies, I'd consider probably those.
Yeah, the elitism kind of rolls into it. Certainly the Catholic Church before the Gutenberg Revolution was authoritarian. It was, well, for one thing, they were the only ones that were literate, were the people who were reading the Bible to the masses. They didn't even have access to print.
Well, even the kings had to get permission from the church to get divorces and whatnot.
And so the idea was that the priests were a conduit from God. They were the authoritative source on disseminating God's word to the people. And then the Gutenberg Revolution with the printing press and Martin Luther and the Lutheran movement, they were able to print out the Bible, and lo and behold, there's all of these passages that venerate the lowly, the downtrodden, the poor, the diseased, that there's really everyone's made in the image of God, everyone's a voice of God, everyone has this dignified spark, this imprint of God. And so that kind of kicked off the Enlightenment and this more distributed, peer-to-peer type organization of society. And, we are at baseline equals. And, I guess kind of... distributed systems like capitalism, that in some forms mercantilism already was partially formed, but mercantilism still needed approval, a charter from a crown. So it's like you're not an established company if you don't have the go-ahead of the monarch, and so that. The printing press and distributed education, literacy, that all kind of lend to this Enlightenment and this move more towards a pursuit in liberty, and that's kind of the root word of libertarian, liberty. Who are you to tell me how to live my life? We're all equals here. We're all.
So really, we're talking about the precursors of classical liberalism.
Yes.
Locke, Montesquieu, a couple others. Okay. That makes sense. Yeah,
and to drive it back to this political compass, this just illustrates that, although the United States discourse of politics is you're either on my side or on the other side, you can think of these things in different terms that add dimension or flexibility, grace of like, hey, we don't agree on this issue, but we're aligned here, so let's cooperate here. And I don't think it's a coincidence that people are so low trust and divided and so tribal, because they do think of it as a one-dimensional spectrum, and you're either on the left or the right.
Why do you think they use left and right, even though this is not a U.S. or American website?
Well, left and right are still used in American discourse.
But this is a UK site.
I see.
So they've got like all these multiple parties and whatever. Why do you think the left and right has, no matter what website you go to, no matter what country, they still have some form of left and right? Why do we have to divide these things into two, I'm wondering?
Yeah.
We can come back to that too. I just always thought, why two? What's the number two? Why do they have to do that type of thing? What are they trying to do to us?
Yeah. I mean, part of it is that our brains inevitably try to categorize things as good or bad, as opposites.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point.
Maybe that's part of it. And I guess the last point to make on the political compass is you've got this axis of authoritarian and libertarian, and these words are useful because they have a root word. And so you can confer from that what the intent of that meaning is. There's like a baseline to it. What does it mean to be politically left or politically right? Those are just purely associative categories, and they evolve over time as a snapshot of like, well, what is this party's, plank, their complete bucket of issues and their stances on those issues, and what's the opposite? And they kind of split into these two buckets. Yeah. And, well, if you think this way on abortion, then you also think this way on healthcare, and you also think this way on the environment, and you also think this way on freedom of speech, and it's absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect example of like what left and right currently are. There've been a snapshot in time. First, we'll start out. Left and right came from the French Revolution.
Yep.
The Second and Third Estate. Third estate being the common people, and they'd be on the left, and the second estate being nobility, which would be on the right. And
so you could roughly say then it was authoritarians were the right, and libertarians, or we're all peers, we want a distributed, self-governed on the left, at least as a starting point.
For the most part, the classical libertarian or classical liberalism was represented by the left, which is like freedom of speech, freedom to carry arms, or freedom to bear arms, and all these stuff, which you don't really associate with the liberals of
the
today.
left right now.
But just to, that's just a starting point. I think your example of left and right now is perfect. Got a chart to show later.
Yeah.
Where it's like, man, that's well said. Okay.
Well, and again, with the root words, those are good anchors. So it's like these terms are, and their connotations aren't going to slip and slide from generation to generation. But because left and right, it's like, well, are you politically Northwest? Like, what would that even mean?
Right.
Are you politically blue? Or, well, I guess people have, but same issue. It's an associative thing.
Right.
It's I'm on this team, and there's no root word anchor point there that you can, well, no, I joined this team because I have these principles, and my group is betraying those, and I'm going to stay steadfast to that anchor principle. And you don't have that if the team that you're filing into is meaningless. It becomes this squishy, unanchored, uncategorized thing that you just are kind of, you're either with the crowd or you're not.
That's good. That's like saying North and South or Union and Confederacy. And if you flip the parties that were at that time, it'd be the exact opposite. And that's how much they can change. So I think that's a good example of left and right. But you're saying Southwest. But if you said the South, those were Southern Democrats, and now the Democratic Party is known for, civil rights and racial issues and things like that. So,
I wish I remember what this phrase is called, but there's like basically every 30 years there's a fundamental shift in the identities of the, I guess in a two-party system, the two parties. But it's like there was a fundamental shift where it's like the Democrats were, the classic example is they were kind of the white supremacist, racist party. And then with LBJ signing that document, it fundamentally shifted to the Republicans kind of had that stigma on them. And that's kind of where the people who were white supremacists, they kind of fled to the Republicans for a generation. And
I don't know if it's flipping the parties, but it's the incorporation of new ideas. Like back then it was social reforms and economic reforms by LBJ. So it's not that the Republican Party didn't actually change or anything. It's just that, they adopted a more, not socialist, but more social programs and whatnot. And then now the Republicans are becoming more populist. So I can see that with the swapping back and forth. But that's also, we've adopted a few new, Republican populism is only a recent thing. And so it's ideas that we adopted from somewhere else. Otherwise, if you're talking about the religious conservatives, they're not any different than they were, or like the classical conservatives, which is limited government and free trade. They're still not like what they are. And so I think Trumpism, conservative populism, as you call it, is just.
And that's another frustrating thing is that these two teams, or these two parties, it's like, oh, that's the party of the religious radicals and the militaristic people and the free market capitalists, and it's like, yeah, but those are all individual things that are completely independent of each other. And if you want to solve a societal problem, you should be comfortable with building coalitions with whoever you happen to be aligning with for that issue. And we are just completely illiterate at that.
Right.
It's, are you on my team? Do you agree with everything I say? Oh, no, you don't? Well, then you're either A, weakening my team, or you're dishonest and you're actually a part of that team, or something along those lines.
Well, especially since they came from the same party, Democrats and Republicans. The Democratic Republican Party. And the only reason they swapped off is because the Republicans, the Whigs at the time, hated Andrew Jackson.
Yeah, and what kind of government do we have?
What do you mean?
A democratic republic, right?
Well, yeah. Arguably, yes.
Arguably. Yeah. All right, so maybe let's get into the next subject. As we talked about, conservatism is it's a philosophy or an ideology, and it's been adopted by Republicans and heavily bastardized. And it's conflated with neoconservatism. Same with liberal and neoliberal. Those are totally different ways of conceptualizing the world, different agendas, different strategies. And so I want to start with picking apart what is a conservative versus a neocon versus a Republican. But conservatism is basically, it's summed up by this quote by Edmund Burke. The great error of our nature is not to know where to stop, not to be satisfied with any reasonable acquirement, not to compound with our condition, but to lose all we have gained by an insatiable pursuit after more. So conservatism, fundamentally, the root word is to conserve, and it's just an appreciation for the culture that you inherited.
Who is Edmund Burke?
He's he's an author, and he's a British or Irish author, I forgot which. But
there's somebody that like writes about conservatism or
he
political
was
topics.
kind of like one of the grandfathers of the conservative voice.
Okay.
But the idea is you have a culture that you inherited, and there's a Darwinian idea there that the things that were valuable to pass on from generation to generation survived. And they were either cherished as far as like folklore, music, food, or they promoted social cohesion, the ability to track the behavior or the range of behavior of your neighbors, kind of how to go about dating. I think that you could argue is it culturally differs, in Indian cultures, there's a lot of matchmaking and a lot of family involvement, and that's very much not the case in the West. And these all have strategies that work very well. And I think conservatism very much fell out of favor, and it's kind of a shit show right now culturally, or like there's not structure to society.
I'm trying to think, where did conservatism eventually, like originally both Republicans and Democrats were conservative. I think that fled the Democratic Party under FDR around that time. Well,
there were always progressives, right, which is the opposite root word to progress, and that would be
a lot of Republicans were progressive back in the day, right, as well.
So,
I think conservatism,
abolition, Reconstruction, that was progressive.
Right.
The temperance movement and the abolition of alcohol, that was considered progressive. Socialism, there was a huge movement of socialism. I'd say between the Gilded Age and the 1930s, that was very progressive.
Yeah, towards the end, until they were stamped out. For
civil rights, that movement was progressive. So it's just
Milwaukee. I think the actual
Bob Lafayette was a socialist.
Well, LaFollette, but he was more the progressive area, and he worked with Teddy Roosevelt. Milwaukee had, I think, 4 consecutive socialist mayors that were actually like full blown.
Wisconsin has a pretty interesting political history. We're actually the birthplace of the Republican Party.
Yeah, we're I shouldn't say where, but
Wisconsin is.
Yeah.
Okay, so then conservatism is an appreciation for the culture you inherited, and what are the downfalls of that is obviously you can have a very traditionalist society that is very stifling, I'd say, especially to individuals and that want to express themselves in different ways. Or if that tradition that you're inherited is not universal in accommodating for the people who make up that society, that's a problem, and it's history is going to bend towards big camping in a way that includes the people who've been marginalized. And so conservatism maybe is more of a kind of like a governor. So it's kind of like a speed limit on the change that happens. Yeah. And there's also an element of, well, the things that survive generation after generation, there's probably something pretty cherished or pretty useful about that. And so
I think that kind of disappeared over the Gilded Age when you had like a bunch of Republicans and introducing the not the FTC, what's our bank, our bank that isn't actually a bank?
The Fed.
The Fed, yeah. Creating the Fed and prioritizing big banking and stuff like that, because those kind of go against the family traditions, cultural traditions, and values that you slowly move away from but we can get into that later.
And a huge part of our traditional identity was Christianity. Yeah. And Judaism, but more so Christianity. And there was, especially, I would say that it was already kind of waning. It took a huge hit in the 1890s. That was kind of the foray into World War I and World War II and secularism, postmodernism. But I'd say kind of the death blow, it was already really weak, but the death blow happened with kind of a rejection of Christianity, especially as a political identity or a core to your political identity, with the neocon movement. And maybe this is a good time to talk about neoconservatism. So there's conservatism and appreciation for the traditions and the culture that you inherited. And neoconservatism was, it's largely associated with this project for the new American century. It was a product of a think tank, people like Tony Blinken. Who else was in that movement and still is?
I don't recall.
John Kerry, the Cheneys, the Bushes. But it's basically, the worldview is that America is exceptional. We are morally superior to other countries around the world. And so it's very might makes right. It's about expanding empire, having a hold on other countries. If we don't like their politics, there's no reason that we shouldn't overthrow them and install a puppet and, take their resources, because we're going to use them better for the greater good of the world. World policing, that kind of idea falls into neoconservatism. Yeah. It's a very war hawkish, empire building ideology. It's pretty universally hated at this point.
Well, I think that's just like, we'll talk about this later, but we're talking about the Federalist Society. I think that's just the new Federalist Society, because you're looking at once, when Trump was running an election, the project
2025.
Yeah, I think it was Project 2025? I think that was called. But they're like, Project 2025, the Federalist Society wrote that, and the Federalist, what they're saying isn't all that untrue, as far as the entity that wrote it is really a scary, shady entity throughout history. But if you we'll look at later where their ideals for federalism, and like if you line them up with what we would consider neocons, it's like, whoa, okay, these guys are neocons, and they're just like they're kind of like the American Illuminati, I think, or maybe the Masons, I don't know.
Yeah. So either way, they're kind of like an elitist group, very social Darwinist of like, yeah, we're better. We're at the top for a reason, and we get to do what we want and, play any games that we want to maintain a grip on power.
Right.
And, if there's a couple plebs, bugs that get squished along the way, sorry, I guess.
Do you know where those ideas originally came from? Is the debates between Plato and Aristotle, neocon type ideas. Debates between Plato and Aristotle. Aristotle, he was skeptical. They were both skeptical of democracy. Aristotle thought you should have sortition instead of election because he said, if you have elections in the representation of the people like we have in the House, that's just going to lead to an oligarchic society, and you need sortition.
What's the argument for inevitably a democracy is going to decay into an oligarchy?
What's this argument? Because you would just have people grandstanding and the people that would get money, and you would just form a party system.
Okay, so there's like a Pareto type phenomenon on...
He described exactly what happened
like social
in America,
capital. Okay.
Right, social capital, also demagoguery, as far as like the people that are more charismatic necessarily shouldn't be running the country or have high IQs. And Plato's argument is he's completely against democracy. He's thought that there should be an elite class that has merit but also has power and charisma, and those should be the ones that represent everybody because they know it's better for other people. Doesn't really sound like a great philosopher to me at that point.
Yeah, no kidding. How do you even determine who belongs in that elite club?
School for it, because at that time the Greeks had the school for philosophers. So that what he called them was the society should be led by philosopher kings, which in equivalent to now it's political kings, basically. So
funny how he was a philosopher.
Huh?
Funny how he was a philosopher.
Well, he thought the philosophers, back in the day, those are the guys that did, most of this type of stuff. So, yeah, it's pretty...
I guess Plato has some decent ideas, but I don't know. Not that one, maybe.
Not that one.
We'll get into another guy who I think generally has good ideas, but went horribly wrong when we get into neoliberalism. Okay, so that's conservatism, neoconservatism, liberalism, like you mentioned before. It's the root word. I don't know if the root word is liberal, like apply liberally, or if it's liberty, like libertarian. And that might be why these terms kind of get tangled up.
It's probably liberal or something like that. I'm just making this completely up. My guess is, I'm going to look it up afterwards, is liberal and it's French.
All right. Yeah.
Because you don't hear the term used until after the French Revolution, really.
Really?
Right.
It's not used during the Enlightenment and
no, I don't think
Voltaire, John Locke.
During the Enlightenment, and I don't think classical liberalism was like named liberalism.
It wasn't named that. Okay, right. So there's a lot of quotes and ideas about it that are kind of bubbling up, but it's not tagged with the term liberal.
No, I think essentially it came from liberty, though.
Okay,
in English.
Fair enough. Okay, so one quote that I found generally sums it up is, all mankind being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions.
Right, John Locke again. Great.
John Locke, yep. And so, again, this was kind of a movement, a live and let live type movement that came out of Lutheranism, the printing press, rejection of monarchies and an exalted church. It was a rejection of authoritarianism and elitism. And it was, we're all images of God. We're all imprinted by God. We all have a dignity. And a starting point should be that I am going to treat you as also a fragment of God. So, you're a complete stranger. You come from a distant land. You have a totally different way of life that seems off-putting to me. The food you make smells weird or unfamiliar to me. But because you are a fragment of God like I am, I'm going to be open to the idea that I have something I can learn from you. And I'd say that I'd say that this is kind of the progenitor to multiculturalism and the idea that, we can intermingle with other cultures and find common cause and kind of exchange and grow together and adopt ideas that weren't from my conservative traditional inheritance.
Is that when they started abolishing slavery or abolitionist movement in most countries, not the U.S.? The U.S. would have came later.
I don't know. I'd say maybe abolition. Gosh, this is another one where I'm gonna be pulling it out of my butt. It might have started in Ireland because they were heavily oppressed, and that's kind of a starting point of liberalism as well. But the idea is, and you see this a lot in kind of Thomas Jefferson's writings, where he's kind of known for being this hypocrite. He's one of the best voices for like all men are created equal, yet he's a slave owner. But you look at a lot of his writings and his principles, and they kind of argue the points that Frederick Douglass kind of picked up later, and is like, look, this country was started on these principles of we're all created equal, and yet we aren't living up to that ideal.
Right.
And so the idea that, again, we're all fragments of God, we're all on equal standing in dignity, that's liberalism, and that does begin to start the conversation of, is slavery morally reprehensible and something to be accepted in a liberal society?
Right.
Now, liberalism can take a bad turn. If you are familiar with computer programming, there's an idea of libraries, extensible libraries. So it's like you're pulling in work that someone else did, and you're incorporating that in your body of work. And so liberalism is kind of unlike other ideologies in the way that it's not its own stand on its own ideology. It's more so a rule set that allows me to interact with you, someone with a different ideology. So it allows this kind of rule set that allows us to interact with each other and start to integrate each other's ways of life. And it's all mostly rules about how do I interact with other people.
Exactly.
And what it's missing is how do I build an identity myself. So with conservatism, that is just answered for you. You get the substance of whatever you inherited traditionally. But if I am just taking the ideology of liberalism and I'm taking it seriously, you can very easily fall into relativism. Well, who's to say that the way you do things that I find disgusting is worse than how I do things? And you can get the structure that you use to form your identity can fall apart, or can lose its structure.
I think it did have it in the beginning because...
What had it in the beginning? What had what?
Liberalism did have that structure because it was basically when classical liberalism still started, there were things that we would consider conservative, which are the family values or whatever.
And also, Christian... at least in the West, it was like very heavily Christian.
They had that profile for conservative, which is what you're talking about, the religious and the family values or the cultural values, and then liberalism, classical liberalism, was actually like on top of that and worked with those values. But then, like, once you take those values and remove those values and only take that moving forward, but then again, the modern liberalism has none of the aspects. I think they're slowly lost in that way. If you don't have the foundation for it, you just start kicking out everything about the classical liberalism.
Yeah, it can be a solvent of your own identity.
Right.
Yeah, and it's a very powerful tool, and I would say anyone I want to interact with, they better understand this rule set of how to interact with people they disagree with. So it's like whoever I interact with,
scream at you, call you a Nazi.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. We'll get into that.
Right.
But if I am interacting with someone that I admire, they're going to understand this extensible library. They're going to appreciate the liberal rule set of how to interact with people that I disagree with. But they're also it can't just be that, because that's just relativism. They also have to have an identity that liberalism is paired with or sitting with.
Right.
The liberalism is the connective interface that allows us to interact with each other, but it can't form the foundation for your own identity. You need a different source. Mm-hmm. And whether that's through narrative, through inherited culture, through, your friends and family, and reading philosophy, and, the mentors you admired, whatever. That's a different project than what liberalism can answer. Right. And to put a pin in this, Nietzsche has a quote in Beyond Good and Evil that kind of talks about how liberalism can dissolve into relativism, where you don't have morality anymore. You don't have an identity. And the quote is, "There is a point in the history of society when it becomes so pathologically soft and tender that, among other things, it sides even with those who harm it, criminals, and does this quite seriously and honestly. Punishing somehow seems unfair to it, and it is certain that imagining punishment and being supposed to punish hurts it, arouses fear in it. Is it not enough to render him undangerous? Why still punish? Punishing itself is terrible. With this question, hard morality, the morality of timidity, draws its ultimate consequence." And so what he's talking about is, if you just identify as liberal and you don't have any identity to pair that with, you are going to fall into relativism, and essentially your society as a whole can fall into immorality. Who's to say that my way of life is better than your way of life? And it's like, you have to be kind of sophisticated to reinvent that wheel of, what are the things to select for when building an admirable, stable, altruistic, healthy identity.
Right.
And maybe that's a conversation for another episode. That's a pretty deep question.
Yeah. Very deep.
Okay, and so liberalism gets conflated with neoliberalism. And this is what I was mentioning before, a guy who generally had good ideas, but this one I find to be an absolute disaster. Milton Friedman, economist, kind of a grandfather of free market capitalism, but he had this terrible idea, which was the Friedman Doctrine, which is that it's the fiduciary responsibility of a corporation to maximize shareholder value. And that's it. That's their premier telos, their premier reason for living, is to make returns for the shareholders. And companies used to be very integrated and embedded in their communities. And, maybe that was incidentally because companies by nature were a lot more local, but they were involved in the churches, they were involved in food drives and volunteering, they'd have socials, a whole bunch of things that get kind of progressively snipped out and trimmed out with the fat when it's about, hey, we quarter after quarter after quarter after quarter, like this cancer, we have to grow. And if we can't grow, we better start cutting employees. And if we can't grow, we better start exploiting labor outside of the country and, setting up shop in countries that don't have these laws that guarantee the dignity of the workers.
I think we should specify that this isn't just like an idea, it's the law. You have to abide by this legally. I just want to inject here that as far as I know, as a trader, the Friedman Doctrine is law. That's the law of the land in the U.S., that you do what is best for your shareholders. I'm not sure if that applies to all countries. I think almost every country has some form of that where you can get sued. So maybe it isn't. Maybe it's a civil law, civil litigation,
Sure.
because you can get sued if you can prove that the majority of the shareholders, that the company is not doing what's in the best interest monetarily for the majority of the shareholders. You can get sued, and
that includes a requirement to grow every single quarter.
Well, to make an attempt to do so.
Okay.
So you can't just say, okay, no, we could have made money this way, but we want to, if you say, hey, we're growing our foundations, if you can make an excuse for it where there's no proof, hey, in the long term we can make more money or whatever. One of the things that comes up is ESG scores and stuff like that. They had to do a lot of explaining. They were sued a lot. How are these ESG scores going to up, our money? And they got a lot more investments, and they could usually show that they got a lot more investment money and advertising money from those ESG scores. But go ahead about the Friedman doctrine.
Yeah, I'm very interested in what that law is, or set of laws is. But nevertheless, there was... companies had a much different standing in the community before the Friedman doctrine started to take off. Right. It used to be, I'm part of the community, I'm integrated with the community, I'm an institution in this local community. I'm not just going to lay someone off because the budget is tight this quarter. And it's neoliberalism, I would say, is a product of the Friedman doctrine taken to the extreme of, or just taken to its natural conclusion of, I have to grow every quarter, I have to grow as a company. How am I going to do it this time? Because, we're giving everyone a raise every year and these wages are high and this is a hard year, it's a recessionary year. Well, there's always this pool of people outside of the country that I can pay a fifth of the salary to. Why wouldn't I just open up shop across these?
Yeah.
And so neoliberalism is basically just the idea. It's so tightly linked with globalism and with multinational corporatism. And
if you can't expand your power using war, you might as well expand it using corporations and the power of corporations. And
it's really useful if this country has these annoying laws that are constraining my growth. Well, these other countries don't. So why wouldn't I just leverage? Maybe not.
I'll have to look it up. I think they have something
chain
like that.
Maybe not the entire supply chain, but the one where I do need that kind of wiggle room as far as, ethics or legalities. I'm going to set it up in this other country.
Well, I mean, that's what they do with, tax evasion. Go to what?
True.
Not the Bahamas anymore. I think it's Aruba. Or no, was it? I don't know.
Would you say that falls under neoliberalism? And then...
Yeah, probably.
And neoliberalism is also such a good partner to neoconservatism with the military-industrial complex, because it's, let's devastate these countries, let's take their resources, and then, hey, the country needs to be built up again. And so let's set up these American corporations that...
Yeah, I consider them the same thing, just using different terminology because they fit so well together.
They do fit so well
usually
together.
People that believe or subscribe to one or the other actually subscribe to
yes.
It's like a neocon.
It's very hard to be a neocon and not a neoliberal.
That's why
they get it.
That's why the establishment gets along so well with each other. It's like, oh, I got these, but I believe this. All right, we work together. All right.
Right.
Wonder Twin powers activate.
It's very gross. And there's this movement that I'd say a lot of the corporate media is very confused by and very afraid of. They're afraid of populism. And a lot of populism is just a rejection of the neoliberal dynasty that has been destroying the countries that it's been the head of for decades now.
Nancy Pelosi, those filthy populists.
Yeah. It's like populism. It's like that the root word populist. Like it's the interests of the commoner, the flyover country. It's the opposite it's the other group than elitists.
Right, exactly. And it's like the foundation of like what our country is, which we originally is like a classical liberalism with other ideologies as well.
Yeah.
But it's like
bunch of farmers and ranchers.
Basically, she's a neocon or a federalist or a neoliberal.
Yeah,
it's crazy.
Okay, so now we're getting into kind of the smears that people throw at each other that they don't even know. If someone calls you an authoritarian, totalitarian fascist, and you say, okay, what's a totalitarian? And then they're like, well, let me just look it up real quick,
right.
you know? And it's like, you don't even know these words that you're throwing around at people to dismiss them. And they are ugly terms. But let's get into what they actually are, how they differentiate from each other, how to use them technically. So we went over authoritarianism a little bit already, root word authority, and I used the quote very infamously from Dr. Fauci, I am the science.
I am the science.
So, yeah, authoritarianism, root word authority, it's the idea of, like, it's basically elitism. It's like a credentialed elitism. It very much goes hand in glove with academia. I'd say that if there's any kind of brand of authoritarianism today, before the credential was, again, being part of the church, the Catholic Church, being literate, that makes you a conduit of God. In secular America today, what makes you an exalted authority is a degree from a university, particularly an Ivy League. But, it's like...
Well, I think they would say that that's meritocracy, even though necessarily it isn't a meritocracy. I think that would be their excuse.
Yeah, but when you get into... It's irresponsible for you to be talking about these subjects because you don't have a degree in this topic. That would be authoritarianism.
Right.
But
if you didn't have a degree in this topic, but in your basement you did your own scientific experiments and stuff like that or whatever, then
that would be irresponsible to an authoritarian.
Yeah.
An authoritarian, you need to have that formal academic credential.
Right, and I think that distinction between meritocracy and the ability to actually like build things on merit and do things on your own and build up to like that's what differentiates it from the authority. All right.
Well, and we have this issue right now where a lot of companies, they're caring less and less about the academic credentials, and they want to just ask, can you do it?
Right.
Can you do the work? And that would be meritocracy. And I don't care if you have formal training or not. If you do, great. If you're at the top of your industry and you had that formal training, you meritocratically got there. You can do it better than anyone else.
Computer science, we're seeing that.
Yeah.
Well, we're seeing it with offshoring work too,
Yeah, but if you're like, you're not allowed to participate in this conversation because this is forbidden knowledge if you don't have an academic degree, that would be authoritarianism. And authoritarianism is, at its core, an appeal to authority. It's a logical fallacy. It's the idea that what matters more than the argument being made is who's making it. You're not a journalist. You're not a medical doctor. You're not a psychologist. So what are you doing talking about this thing? Never mind if you are a stakeholder in your mental health or your body as the person who has to suffer any consequences of the health decisions you make. Mm-hmm. It's like, if it's irresponsible to talk about health or mental health, which I think there's the stigma of that in this country and many other places, then the ideas of informed consent and second opinion mean nothing. They're completely incompatible with that idea that it's irresponsible to talk about these medical subjects, behavioral health, if you don't have a degree.
Yeah.
So then what? You are left to only talking about behavioral health issues, medical issues with your primary doctor and no one else. It would probably be irresponsible for you to like get a second opinion, because who are you to how could you decide for yourself which of those two? I don't know.
Well, even people with a degree, like some of the creators of the mRNA vaccine are saying, well, these vaccines are irresponsible and stuff like I guess we can't talk that much about it on this platform, but
yeah,
they were saying that you know, there should have been more rigorous testing with those vaccines, and you know, we kind of overwrote that with our authorities. So if you were first went to school,
yeah,
and then you have like governmental or organizational authority of some,
that imbues you with even more authority,
right?
Yeah.
And they have the power to like tamp down anything else, even if you've
and
got
then
a degree.
they are the science. End of conversation.
Right. In our government, I went to school. The government selected me, whatever. Yeah.
Well, and there's also two other massive problems with this academic authoritarianism, and one of them is academics themselves are kind of cowering away from debate with people that are peripherally outside the depth of what their technical degree or specialization is in.
Right.
So there's like no there's no venturing outside of whatever your degree is in, and that's usually where scientific discovery is made, is kind of when you are starting to venture outside of the formal school of thought of whatever you're taught, and you're starting to interact with people with different intellectual backgrounds.
I see a problem with that. The opposite, though. Like, if you remember Obama's climate change consensus, and if you looked at the people that actually signed it or whatever, that most of the people weren't atmospheric scientists. Like, you had like 3 or something like that, and you had like thousands of signatures. And most were like in things that were, you had computer science in there. You had like all sorts of things that weren't like related at all. And so like, I think the danger
and this maybe speaks to why authoritarianism is appealing, and why sometimes maybe it does have a place, although it's not.
People are just scummy.
Sensibility wise, it's not what appeals to me, because I know there's that fallacy of authority at the heart of it.
If you pay people and put some green in their hands, they'll come up with like the academic articles that you need, or they'll sign any piece of paper. So it's kind of, if those are the only people who can have the conversation, and it's just this conversation is black box to anyone who doesn't have the degree. It's forbidden knowledge, and if that narrow field gets captured by moneyed interests, well then you treating that conversational topic as a black box you're just inevitably prey to whatever corruption happened, and there's no fixing it. You're considered a conspiracy theorist even if you like interject, even if you have knowledge about a subject. It's like, based on the math of these carbon rates, what do we do if
even if you can point to examples in the past? It's like,
right,
there were MDs that very much took up the scientific argument for smoking tobacco is fine. It's not going to cause lung cancer.
Right.
You're crazy. Or, it's like doctors are ethical. Okay, but they were also incentivized and very much took advantage of prescribing Percocet and the opioids. It's like...
Or climate change is bad, but New York is not going to be under 23 feet of water in 5 years.
Sure, yeah.
That's where I was coming from.
Yeah, I think people underestimate the incentives that can perverse this very fragile priority of the truth in even scientific pursuits. I think a true scientist, an ideal scientist, would not get perverted in that way. But like you said, there's a lot of people who care more about success, even if they chose the modality of a scientist to be successful.
Right.
If what they wanted was to be successful and their idea of getting there was being a scientist, then they're absolutely going to take that incentive. I had another reason why that narrowing is such a bad thing in academia, but it's escaping me right now.
All right.
Totalitarianism. Root word total. Totalitarianism is, or totalizing. It's summed up by the phrase, "You're either with me or against me," and cults are very totalitarian. Obviously, Stalinism was very totalitarian. Anything where, I guess, a pirate ship or under a captain, that would have been a totalitarian setting, where it's, hey, if you don't agree with my dictates, you're off.
Dictatorship.
You're overboard.
In politics, for the most part, right?
Yeah, dictatorships. Yeah. The Catholic Church in a lot of its history was totalitarian.
Definitely.
The Pope. That's the interpretation of God's word, and if you go against that, we have a problem.
Right. Unless you give me money.
Pretty simple. Yeah, fair enough. It's a pretty simple idea. I don't know if we have to go too far into detail here, but it's basically people who have no tolerance for people who think differently. Right. That would be totalitarian. Fascism. We have a clip for this. Actually, can you pull up the Wikipedia definition of fascism? Okay. I absolutely hate this definition of fascism. Fascism, according to Wikipedia, is a far-right, authoritarian, and ultra-nationalist political ideology and movement characterized by dictatorial leader, centralized autocracy, militarism, forcible suppression of opposition, belief in natural... It goes on and on. It's all of these associative things that are these were fascist movements, and they had these things in this giant bucket, and so that's what fascism is. And I find that to be a very poor definition of what fascism is. Like we've established, far right, okay. Right, the meaning of what is right or left changes over time. Nazism was a national socialist. If you look at the political compass, socialism is centralized economy. Why wouldn't that be left-wing? And so I don't like this definition. If you're going by the definition of the person who founded fascism, which was Benito Mussolini, he defines fascism just very simply as the marriage between church and state. And I find that to be a useful definition. Very technically, it's concise.
Church?
Sorry, not church and state.
Corporations.
Corporation and state. Thank you. It's a very concise, a lot more coherent definition, and it has a very technical reason why it's so pernicious and why it might lead to, inevitably, a dictatorial leader, centralized autocracy, forcible suppression of opposition, belief in natural social hierarchy. All of these things that follow can very easily be instituted if there is a marriage between corporation and state. And if you play the clip real quick, this is Thomas Sowell describing Barack Obama. The question is he a socialist?
Talk about President Obama. Do you think he's a socialist?
No, not technically, I suppose, because socialism usually means the government ownership of the means of production. The pattern he's following is much more like that of the fascists, where the government leaves the means of production in private hands and the politicians tell them what to do. And that's much more politically viable, because after the government forces the private industry to do something and it turns out disastrously, you can always haul the people from private industry up before congressional committees, denounce them on television and so forth, leaving out the fact that it was you who forced them to do what they did.
And this is the way you see, for example, the health care reforms that were passed.
Well, I was thinking actually about the financial reforms and particularly the housing collapse. That the people who, Barney Frank in the House, Senator Chris Dodd in the Senate, were the people who pushed for all kinds of mortgage lending standards to be reduced, making mortgage lending enormously more risky than it had ever been before. And when all of that collapsed, they then summoned all the leaders of financial institutions up before their committees and spent hours denouncing them and so forth on nationwide television. I mean, they understand that the best defense is a good offense. And so this is great political theater. It has nothing to do with reality.
Well, what about the private sector, though? I mean, you know, it is true, isn't it, that there were lots of kind of risky bets that were being made with a lot of money, which was private money, certainly, but it would have a public effect. There are lots of kind of external effects.
There was some of that. More often, the risk was the lenders. One of the reasons lenders don't care whether you're really a good risk is they sell the mortgage to you, and then they sell it. They make out the mortgage to you. Then they sell it to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and the risk now is Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac's risk.
That clip, very brilliantly by Thomas Sowell, explains the perniciousness of Benito Mussolini's construct of fascism. Picks on Obama there. I think there's plenty. I think at least since Bush. I think even before that, we've had fascistic administrations for a long time, and I think it really peaked with Biden. But anyway, the mechanism is you have government, and they have their policies that are that they're heavy-handed in, insist on imposing on the populace. Never mind if it violates the Constitution. I want to control the populace. And so because I, as the government, have the Bill of Rights saying you cannot do this, I am going to lean on and pressure corporations to institute my policies for me.
Right.
And you heard people all the time say, well, Twitter is a private company. They can do what they want as far as freedom of speech. Facebook is a private company. Those are very fascistic arguments because, as it turns out, revealed by the Twitter files, Matt Taibbi and Michael Schellenberger, the Biden administration and the FBI and the CDC and all of these government institutions were pressuring the social media sites to censor Americans. And so that was policy by the government to violate our First Amendment rights,
Right.
Our Bill of Rights, through the vehicle of corporations. And I have an issue with corporations violating my First Amendment rights, my Bill of Rights. It is a little bit more messy, but anytime that government is pressuring corporations to enact government policy, that would be fascism.
So would you consider reforms and regulations as
Fascistic?
yeah, or would they not be fascistic because they're targeting entire industries for the country rather than individual companies and corporations?
This is something that libertarians get wrong a lot, is that they're very skeptical of any government regulations.
Right.
I think that there are regulations that are necessary and make the world a lot safer and cleaner and a lot less electrocuted people plugging things in outlets and a lot more functional as far as electromagnetic noise that allows for devices to communicate, so much overlap.
But abstractly, they're telling them what to do. Maybe it's telling them what to do as far as how to communicate with
here's
their
the differentiation.
customers and whatnot.
Regulatory capture is fascistic because I'm a government enterprise, I'm a government entity, and I am regulating in a way that is going to have kickbacks, going to enrich my narrow constituency, not the voting population, but the lobbyists that funded my campaign. Well, how else does regulatory capture happen?
What if you're doing it for the country and not for yourself? I mean, there's so many things that
would be non-lobbied subsidy, I guess. Okay,
I think we'd have to talk about it more, because if it's kind of like morality, there's nothing set in stone. It would be up to something. We'd have to like come up with some model that work, because I don't like things that are flimsy
gray area.
or opinionated.
There's a gray area. It's like there's reasons why regulation exists. There's reasons why subsidies exist.
Right.
But the idea of regulatory capture, of I'm regulating this industry to give these companies in that industry a monopoly or a leg up, that I would argue is... Yeah, well, maybe that's just corrupt and monopolistic, but not necessarily
it's a great subject to have another discussion over, because mine offhand would be like, how if you as a government are regulating or telling companies how to interact with your customers and consumers and etc. That to me would be more I think we could come up with a definition I think we could come up with solid definitions for that. Anyway, I'm done with that. We'll move on.
If government is enacting change through pressuring corporations, especially in a covert way, I don't know how that would not fall under this Mussolini definition of fascism. But yeah, maybe another episode.
Yeah, too. Because I can think of about 20 examples where it's like,
And maybe we need to go into... So I think it's overplayed, but maybe we need to get someone on to talk about or defend the definition of fascism that I have a problem with. But it drives me crazy.
Do you have people Wikipedia, that actually... Probably someone that's
No, not particularly, but...
Who
I'd be interested to talk to.
Antifa type person, or...
Yes, people who feel strongly of like, no, fascism is and has to be defined as a far-right authoritarian nationalistic ideology.
Let's look. We can probably find someone.
But I find that application to be sloppy and not very useful, because it's like you're kind of stepping back from these governments that were tagged as fascist, and you're just describing the elements of it. That's not its own functional stand on its own definition, like the marriage of corporation and state. So, to me, that term is a lot more useful. And if you're going to charge someone as a fascist, it's like you are ruining the market competition by manipulating it with policy, and you're using it for political shortcuts, or for actually dismantling the Bill of Rights and like the foundation of our government. You're like you're using a back door to be unconstrained by the laws that protect the populace. That would be fascism.
Yeah.
Nationalism, which a lot of people are smeared with, is when someone calls you a dirty nationalist or a racist, bigoted nationalist, they're always conflating nationalism, in my mind, with ethno-nationalism.
Definitely.
And yeah, there's this idea of like, it's almost like a unsophisticated conservatism. It's caring more about race as a construct than like culture. And it's like, oh, I'm German, and necessary to that identity is not the lederhosen and the bratwurst and all the music and all and what industriousness. It's white skin and if you don't share that, then you are betraying my national heritage and you're out. And that would be ethno-nationalism.
Well, I think their
which is what
argument
most
would be,
people conflate with nationalism.
Their argument would be like, well, American culture is white culture, is probably what they would say.
Yeah, I use German as an example, but those people would be ethno-nationalists.
Right.
I am tying the idea of the identity of America with white skin, and
right.
because I'm trying to preserve that, I want to purify the country and make it all white people, and that's ethno-nationalism.
Right.
That is bad.
But they'd muddy the waters. It's like, well, you believe in like nationalism, you love our culture and Americanism
right.
or whatnot, but white people aren't the ones that built this country. It's the people of color that actually built this country, is what they say. Quite a lot.
Which is also an ethno-nationalist argument.
Right, but they're calling other people ethno-nationalists because they're saying, well, this is white culture is the one in power or something similar of that.
Yeah, the Reconquista movement is a non-white ethno-nationalist movement as well.
Right.
So it's like there's examples of both, and they're both losing the forest for the trees, whatever that expression is. It's like, I can't believe we're talking about this in 2025, but it's like the value of a human is not summed up by their skin pigmentation. Like, can we just, culture matters. That's what people struggle with integrating. That's what's important to integrate. Culture shock can absolutely happen if there's a mass influx of people of a different culture into an area. We see a lot of crises like that going on. We did in the Biden administration. We did with the EU. There's a big backlash. That's what Brexit was about.
And we're not white culture or one culture. We are multicultural, and
America?
And when we first came here, it's like we had the Germans and the Italians and the Irish or whatever.
French,
just because they have white skin or whitish skin, that doesn't mean they're all the same. The cultures and the way they lived were completely different.
Well, and they were regarded as different races. I don't want to go into the whole
Very
race
different.
thing. We have to with ethno-nationalism.
Yeah.
But yeah, nationalism and patriotism, I think, fell under attack as a reaction to, again, the neoconservative movement in post 9/11. It was kind of like, you're not a patriot, you don't love this country if you don't back those wars. And liberals got super pissed about that, and patriotism, nationalism became a very dirty team, and it became very cynical and hypocritical and gross to want the best for your country. And that, to me, is just what nationalism is. It's, I want my country to flourish. I want my country to thrive.
I think it was the Patriot Act, wasn't it? Patriot
yeah, that
Act.
too. Yeah.
It's like, just because they named something with Patriot or National Defense, and it's like, did they fool you? That's not what those words mean. Why are you suddenly...
No, but there were people who identified as patriots that were very totalitarian leading into the Iraq War.
Oh, yeah.
If you didn't go along with, hey, maybe this is a bad idea, you didn't love the country, you were a traitor, you were a terrorist sympathizer, you were someone who, might deserve to get shipped off to Gitmo or get, that was a very ugly, scary time as far as,
we didn't know things too. Like, when we first invaded
the national security
when we went to Afghanistan, we bombed Afghanistan. They told me at work, and they're like, we bombed them, we got them. I was like, yeah.
Let's stay another 20 years.
Whatever. Yeah, that's the thing. The aftermath. The same thing with Iraq. We don't have the information. Like, oh, no, Iraq has nothing to do with anything.
That's true. There was the pretext for going in, which was a lie.
They have nukes. They're mad at us for what we did. They could.
But it's like, yeah, you can give grace for the people who were lied into those wars.
Right.
But yeah, they did last for 20 years longer than it's like, if we went in for the reasons we said we would, we wouldn't still be here. And also, this is like where all of the poppy fields like
Yeah.
in the world are grown.
I'm
and
the exact
oil
opposite.
And
It's like somebody like Russia is attacking Ukraine. I don't care. It's like, yeah, you're full of crap. We're the ones that did it. When anything that happens, we're the ones that did it is my default, basically.
what was that pipeline? Nord Stream pipeline.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It wasn't just that. It was just us. We launched the coup, and we broke our treaties, and we did everything.
Yeah,
And then we're allowing their actual Yahtzees, the Ukrainian people, like they're killing the whole
not good
Donbass. I don't know. Donbass. Yeah, they're killing everyone in that region. It's like, what the heck? Anyway, move on from these sordid issues.
Okay, communism. Going into smears of the left. Although a lot of the left does unironically identify as communist. And my understanding of it, we have someone we'll probably debate in a later episode on communism, but the quote is from Karl Marx: "The theory of communism may be summed up in one sentence: abolish all private property." And someone I know that self-identifies or is okay with the label of being called a communist, he distinguishes between personal property, like a toothbrush, and private property, which would be the toothbrush factory making the toothbrushes. And I guess the idea is when you like have this equipment that can produce wealth, it has to be shared publicly. I find
anything can produce wealth.
Yeah, and it's like if you have your own personal space, like your room, and you start to use that as a productive space that you're producing things, and you have to scale it and start enlisting other people, does that space now transform into private space, and now therefore you are no longer, it's unethical to hold that space? There's this schism to scale things where it's like this breaks down, and no wonder these communist regimes had to import industrial goods because they couldn't produce it on their own. I don't know. It's another topic for another episode.
Well, that's right. It goes back to using definitions, though. It's like if you've got something, like we were talking before, if you've got a definition that's like not there's no substance to the definition, just say. If there's opinions, like if I hear personal property, if I ask 10 communists what personal property is compared to private property, they'll all answer different questions, or they'll provide me with different answers.
Well, I'd say there are schools of thought where it's like, this is what makes it private property versus personal property. But
no, because then, like you just said, camera, you could be using it for yourself to take pictures, or you could be selling those pictures. Then what is the camera?
And if you hire someone to take pictures of you, are you exploiting them?
And if you can't define any of that, then it's junk. Then then your thought in the definition is junk, and you need to fix it. I've got no problem with fixing it. Like if you fix it, I'll give it 100% listen to it.
And as a lot of people concede, a lot of the critiques that Karl Marx had on capitalism are valid, and we are living through like end stage, late stage capitalism today. I don't know if it's a fall of Rome type situation or if it's just another business cycle, but it does seem to be
just another cycle.
I think. I just don't remember cycles like.
Well, you weren't living yet. Yeah,
fair enough.
Why you don't remember that.
So we've gone through like ugly?
5 or 6 Gilded Ages. Yeah, no, worse than this. We aren't even at the worst yet.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, we're not at the people realizing that.
If you go back to the East India Trading Company and the Dutch trading companies, way worse.
Yeah, fair enough.
And in our Gilded Age, we're getting to the level that we were in our previous Gilded Age.
Yes. Okay. Postmodernism. This is.
I don't even know what
probably
this is.
Even worth another episode. It's another junk philosophy, in my opinion. It's basically the idea that all narratives, all framings that people share for contextualizing, their lives, are subjective and relativistic. And who's to say that my way of interpreting things, perceiving the world, are better than your way? It's basically relativism. It's basically every single way of categorizing the world is subjective, and not. It's only as real as your perception of it. It's a very heady, and I frankly find very not useful philosophy. But we can, I don't know, maybe we can debate a postmodernist. God help us on that.
What that is. I'd have to look at it first.
Well, what are some other terms that the left is generally smeared with or dismissed with? Liberal. But when people call someone a dirty liberal, they're not using the appropriate framing of liberal.
Snowflake? Freak?
Yeah. None of those are useful ideologies to hang your hat on, but...
I don't think. I mean, postmodernism.
There's a lot of people who will take up that, will willfully adopt that phrase. Yes, I'm a postmodernist.
No, I'd have to do another segment on it. I'd have no familiarity with it. I mean, I've heard the word before, but I haven't used it like accurately used or from a source that might, I don't know what it is offhand. So let's move on.
So the last kind of common political identity, I would say, that people will use in this country, they'll say, I'm not Republican, I'm not liberal or Democratic, I'm a libertarian. And usually when people say I'm libertarian, what they mean is, I find government problematic, the less of it, the better. I want to live my own life, and people can leave me the hell alone. I don't want you telling me how to live my life. I don't want the government telling me how to live my life. I want to be self-sufficient and let other people live the way they want to live. I would say that's generally how people approach libertarianism. Would you add anything to that or correct anything there? Or would you say that's a
just
fair characterization of how most
their
people...
mascot should be a naked cowboy riding a unicorn with a Gadsden flag, smoking a joint with the left hand. That's what they're...
Yeah.
But I don't... they're so hard to...
categorize?
Yeah, because the schisms in the party, like, it's not just one or two, it's like 10 or 20, and they all they all take one thing from classical liberalism
and take it to the extreme.
And then like everybody disagrees with the other thing, which, oh no, I don't believe in that classical liberalism idea. I just have this one idea and I hang my hat on it because I don't like Republicans or Democrats in the two-party system and whatnot, and I don't have any place to belong, so I'm a libertarian.
Yeah, and a classic example of that is like open borders. It's like, I don't want any laws, leave me alone, I want to be able to travel wherever I want to travel. And then some people will say, well, you have doors on your house for a reason. You can't live your own life if any old vagrant can walk through your house and take your shit.
Right.
And so that's kind of the libertarian debate on open borders as one of many dimensions that people take to the extreme of, I don't want government setting rules for me.
Yeah, and they wouldn't really believe in, since they believe in the rugged individualism, they wouldn't believe in, too many social programs to help people as well. And then when you have those social programs and people just come in from other places and partake of those social programs, that damages the nation, So hard to say.
Yeah, and you brought up the term rugged individualism. I think that is a very common through line of libertarians. That's where they would largely agree. I want to minimize government. I want to be left to my own devices. I want to take care of myself. And a lot of them, if pushed, will have kind of the flippant attitude of, well, what if someone can't take care of themselves? Sucks for them.
Yeah, exactly.
And I find that to be the weakest kind of core mindset of libertarianism. I think it's why it's looked at as a joke, why a lot of people are hesitant to adopt it, because you look selfish. And if just on a technical level, if you have people in a society that can't take care of themselves, as inevitably happens, like people get chronically ill, people get drug addicted, is it ethical to just let them lay on the street and starve out?
No.
I don't think so. A lot of those people, if you can bring them back, they're very thankful that someone was there to pick up the pieces, and they can be contributing members of society. Anyway,
well, another term is like don't teach a man to fish, don't give a man a fish. I don't know if you've ever heard that before, but it's like, okay, when's the last time you've actually taught a man to fish? Never.
And this is a technically fatal what do you call it, blind spot of libertarianism, is that I'm a rugged individualist. I'm going to take care of myself. I'm self-sufficient. I'm not draining from society. I don't need rules so that people treat me the right way, and anyone who can't learn to swim is just holding us back. Well, there's people who inevitably have problems that they can't solve themselves, and either you have to help them learn to fish or help solve their problems for them because they can't solve their own problems. And if you don't do that, you are ceding those problems to the government to solve. They get to claim those problems whether they can actually solve them or not. California with the homeless crisis. Yeah, we'll solve the problem, and we'll take in billions of dollars a year and, pay ourselves $400,000 salaries, and darn, the homeless problem is just getting worse, and we need more money than ever because this is such a, hard problem to get a handle on. And libertarians are right that government very much lends to waste, fraud, and abuse. It doesn't have the same constraints as private industry, where if you run out of money, that was your own incompetency, your own fault, your own mismanagement of money. You're done. Mm-hmm. Find something else to do. Government doesn't have that. If a program fails, well, we were just underfunded. Let's get more funding. And there is a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse in government, and they also get to lay claim on the problems that you as a society don't own yourself. And so any libertarians out there who want to minimize government in a practical way, you need to start being what our podcast is about, more civically minded, right, and start proactively solving these problems for society. And so that's what this podcast is about. How do we get together as citizens and find other vehicles than government to solve our own problems, so that you don't have to resort to tax funded, well, I'm going to take money from everyone to take up my cause, which I find unethical and frankly incompetent, and maybe hypocritical, but there's other ways to solve problems that this country used to know how to do. They used to know how to get together and build a barn. They used to know how to, all of these public parks, and I don't know, what are some other examples of how people solved problems together voluntarily, not through reliance on government. I guess church used to do a lot, but church has fallen away, and it's kind of polite not to talk about your religious identity in any capacity. So it's like, how is that ever supposed to be a meaningful part of any community anymore.
I think in California, each homeless person is allocated like $80,000 per homeless person is how much they, and like,
and how much of that do you think they see?
None. And the church is the churches out there are the ones that are actually, taking care of the homeless on
keeping
a daily
them
basis.
alive.
Yeah. So it's like, I don't know. Something to talk about in the future though.
Yeah. And the last topic I think I wanted to go over was one that you brought up in passing last week or 2 weeks ago, and that's this phrase or this term that I never was exposed to in school. It's really sad that I wasn't, but can you describe communitarianism?
Communitarianism. Actually, I think I'll cover our Aristotle later, and I think that the idea stemmed from Aristotle, and it's that to become a good citizen in the citizenry, it's basically to build. He believed that a strong whole was created by stronger, smaller units or communities, and it was in the city-state of Athens. And you'd have different schools or whatnot, and you'd all support each other within those communities, and then the money came from the communities up, and you built from the communities up, and that was the best way to have a good foundation. And equivocating to now, it would be like if you'd paid taxes, if your first taxes helped your local schools and communities, and the majority of your taxes, and then it trickles down to the state government and then to the federal government as an example, and you have a better system of reliability or safety nets that are built within the community instead of giving, government money, that you have programs within the community with that money, because at the community level, you know how to best serve the impoverished or whatever in your community typically.
Sure.
Rather than the government, because the government, once you give it to the national government, so much money is wasted because that money goes to them and then it goes out to contractors or somewhere else. And
it really delocalizes the money.
Right.
Which,
that's like, it's kind of like sending the money to a volunteer organization a lot of times, depending on the volunteer. The money goes through so many hands and everybody gets their cut until it gets there, when the money goes right to the community.
And it filters through all of their agendas.
And then you actually you can put responsibility in somebody's hand, being like, you're the person in charge of this for my community. It was your money. You took this money or whatever. When it goes to national level, it's an abstract thing. We don't have any idea on a day-to-day basis, like what the money is being spent on. There's no accountability.
Well, and I think we've talked about this too. The framers were not around when GoFundMe was around, but it's like, if you had like a duty to pay, let's say $7,000 in taxes a year, whatever. If they had GoFundMe at the time, would we have a setup where it's like, okay, I'm paying this money into this community. I'm going to make sure that the projects that I care about, I'm represented. My money's represented in. So I have to pay $7,000 to this pool, but I get to, as the person paying in, allocate where my money goes. And if those things, fixing up the roads, whatever else, public works, if you're California, I guess refilling your reservoirs with water out, I don't know, we're picking on California a lot, but they deserve it.
That's actually one of the ideas as well. And the thing is, I looked it up in preparation for this. I'm like, do I want to mention communitarianism and all? It's like, this was a thing when I was like in high school and early college, and now it's like disappeared. It's like even the ideas have disappeared. The party has disappeared.
I've never heard of this term. No. And it's such an important idea. And it perfectly represents what we're discussing.
Somebody made it disappear, James. But I'll speak about that conspiracy theory later.
Yeah. But, we have one other thing to go over. But, yeah, if you had $7,000 to tax pay that you had to do, why can't you decide what that allocates to? And let's say, your top thing is like, our roads are destroyed. I want the roads fixed up. And maybe most of the other people in the community, that's their top item too. And it's like, great. Everyone pays $7,000. The community's 100 people, whatever. And it only took $70,000 to build up the road. So it only took 10 people's whole $70,000 to repair the roads. And so the rest of your money you get back, split evenly, but between the constituency, and the next project that you wanted funded is the next one that gets prioritized. And it's like, it would be so easy to do a system like this. There wouldn't be this changing of hands. There'd be a lot more control into the taxpayer as to where their money's going. And
well, our representatives couldn't, what's it called, dog ear funds, earmark funds.
Earmark sounds right, but what about that? What's the issue?
Oh, it's because the people right now that represent us they take our funds and they can mark off a special place where they want to spend the money, and usually it's related to those people.
Yeah, and that's a dumb system.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's another reason I am excited about this podcast is that we can talk about things outside of the box. That is like, enough talking about abortion already. Okay, I don't know what everyone's stances are. You know, I still think you deserve dignity, whatever. You know, I don't know. We can agree to disagree on different controversies, but can we talk about other things that, you know, there could very well be solutions that everyone agrees on? Like, can we move away from these wedge issues that we've been stuck on for decades? Drives me crazy. Gun rights, I don't know.
Oh, I think we can talk. I don't think we should limit ourselves, but it's not like we're going to solve the debate. But I mean, we probably think there is a middle ground between the two, and what we say the middle ground is, and like leave it at that. But
my point is, I think I'm excited to talk about things that people don't talk about. That it's like, this is an idea that would be a slam dunk. Why isn't it part of the broader public discourse? Anyway, should we cut it there, or
okay? If anybody watching this in the future has any ideas about any labels that they don't like or any way to fix the system, please comment. Please well, we don't have an email or anything yet.
No,
please make note.
TBD.
We'll read it like 9 years from now or whatnot.
Right.
Okay.
Maybe we should have a PO box or something.
Okay, that's all for episode 1 of Civic Engines. Thank you for watching. If you did watch. See you later.
Bye-bye.